With that, I have the pleasure of introducing Ricky White, who has worked as an ecologist specializing in southeastern United States vegetation communities since graduating with a master's degree in ecology from UNC Chapel Hill in 1995. In his 16 years with NatureServe, he's helped create 25+ national park vegetation community maps, coordinated spatial content, landscope.org, and more recently worked as PI on this project with a team that included Clay Ware, Randy Wilson, Carl Nordman, Milo Pine, and Chuck Hunter. Ricky is based in Durham, North Carolina, so now he's going to unmute and take it away, Ricky.
Great, thanks. And Greg, do you just want to give me a quick warning if I end up going over on time and I can wrap up quickly?
Yes.
Great, thanks. One of the people I forgot to mention when I gave Greg the information earlier was Catherine Rideout, who also was really involved in this work. So I'm happy to be talking to you about this project, which we worked on over the past couple of years with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So Randy and Clay are both with Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm with NatureServe. We were really excited to get some funding to support this work from the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks LCC. So that was the key to actually getting this project done. So today I'm just going to try to give you an overview of the work that we did, the process that we took to get the work done, and the products that are available as part of this work, as well as some of the things that we're going to work on as we move forward. We're also going to stop occasionally and ask the audience some questions to give us some feedback on you guys. So I believe that Toby and Greg were going to run the question part of this. So I wanted to go ahead and pose the first question to the audience, and then you guys will have an interactive, I guess, pop-up box on your screen that will allow you to answer that question. So the first question is, please tell us the primary role or roles you play in your job.
Okay, I will launch that poll now.
Thanks.
And I'm going to give everyone about a minute.
Okay. While you're answering that question, I can just keep talking. And so just maybe close it after a minute. I'll keep going with my presentation once it's closed. The idea behind this work is that you know, we really wanted to create some rapid assessment metrics for measuring the wildlife habitat value and the ecological integrity of open pine ecosystems. We recognize that you know, not all longleaf pine is created equal. So you know, back when we were first doing longleaf pine conservation, there was more of an emphasis on, you know, getting the acreage of longleaf pine up through planting, and that's great. But we realized pretty quickly that that just planting alone wasn't going to get us the species that were associated with that open pine habitat. So our goal is to really look at creating some rapid assessment metrics that help us understand whether the canopy, the mid-story, and the understory are what we call in condition or out of condition, to give land managers a better understanding of how their stands are doing. So,
okay, Ricky, here are the results from the poll. It looks like we had pretty good participation. We had 92% answer. And I will, it looks like a pretty broad mix of fields here. I'm going to go ahead and hide this and give it back to you unless you have something to say about the results.
Yeah, it would be great to save those results because it would be a useful thing for us to look at later as well, if that's possible. Okay, so like I said, as we all know, not all longleaf stands are created equal. You know, the one on the lower right is obviously overly shrubby, and then the one on the upper left has some qualities that we think of as a, generally speaking, good habitat for a lot of the kinds of species that we're interested in. So we're really interested not just in longleaf acreage, but also in the condition of that acreage to help us understand whether those stands are actually providing the habitat that we would like them to provide. You know, I imagine most of the folks on the phone, and from the poll, it looks like a lot of the folks on the phone are fairly experienced with the issues we're dealing with. But I just want to take a moment. You know, these are pictures I've taken over the past couple of years, you know, including around Wilmington, North Carolina, where there's some pretty large amounts of development that are eating up some of the last of the longleaf pine stands. You can still see the longleaf pine trees in the front and backyards of some of the new houses that were developed there. There's obviously issues like lack of fire, which is one of the big ones, invasives, and then poaching. But there's also some opportunities as we move forward and try to do more restoration. And I think that these metrics will, yes? Oh, sorry, I thought I heard someone say something. I think these metrics would help to, you know, give us a better understanding of those wildlife habitat conditions. And, you know, some examples of those opportunities may be, there's plenty of species associated with these open pine habitats that are, you know, potentially close to being or could be listed under the Endangered Species Act. You know, if we do good management and we're able to demonstrate that we have more wildlife habitat for some of these species, then we may be able to avoid altogether that listing, and that gives us some more flexibility and wiggle room in the future for all kinds of reasons. Our team's approach was fairly organic and interesting. We NatureServe was asked to create some ecological integrity assessment metrics that were rapid in nature for the Forest Service back about 6 or 8 years ago. So we were working on that project. At the same time, we realized that the Fish and Wildlife Service was working on a similar project that was more focused on desired forest condition of a suite of wildlife habitat or a suite of wildlife species that are associated with open pine. So we realized that our NatureServe approach was more focused on the plants and the vegetation communities. Theirs was more focused on wildlife habitat. Why not try to combine those two approaches into one approach that would give us a more holistic view of how the habitat was doing in terms of both the plant species and the wildlife habitat we were concerned about. So because we were funded through the LCC work, we really focused on the species that the Science Committee for the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks, LCC, had picked out as potential indicators for good open pine habitat. Now, obviously, there's a wide range of habitat needs represented in this this list of species. You know, on one extreme, there's pine and prairie warblers, which arguably have a very wide range of habitat, down to things like red cockaded woodpeckers and gopher tortoises that have a very narrow range, both in terms of condition and sometimes in terms of soil. So we wanted to take all of those together and try to create kind of a flexible approach that will allow us to look at where we could kind of maximize the wildlife habitat values for these species. And we were trying to use, as much as possible, the established literature, which included a lot of peer-reviewed journal articles, some of the Fish and Wildlife Service fire management species profiles, and a lot of other data that we had collected at NatureServe and through the Forest Service through the past 20 years. Obviously don't want to bore you with the details, but this is just one example of some of the kinds of reports and studies that we used for the literature review to start trying to build that list of what metrics we were going to use and what the cutoffs would be. So just to break things up a little bit, let's go to question 2. And what I'm going to do, though, first is just go back to this species list and have you look at it just for a moment. And the question is, and I'm going to have to paraphrase because I don't have it in front of me right now, but do you work on lands where you're interested in the conservation of one or more of these species? So Toby, would you mind cranking that up for a second again?
Okay.
Thanks. And while y'all are answering that, again, I'll just keep talking. The geographic scope of the project and the conceptual scope of the project were two of the first things that we really needed to work out. And so with the idea in mind that we knew we were going to work on something that incorporated both key indicator species wildlife habitat values and kind of vegetation community and plant dynamic issues, we wanted to look at the geography and try to make sure we understood where exactly we were going to, what the boundaries, geographic boundaries were of the work that we were going to do, but also the conceptual scope of what we meant by open pine. So in this case, we came up with the definition of open pine that was larger than just longleaf dominated communities. In this case, open pine stands were defined as a set of open pine stands with a diverse ground cover composed of native warm season grasses and forbs, often with some low shrubs and only sparse tall shrubs. These open conditions were historically maintained by natural processes, including fire and grazing, and today require active management to maintain or to restore the open herbaceous conditions preferred by many species of wildlife.
Okay, Ricky, I don't know if you can. I don't think you can see the poll results, but we've got 75 attendees, 93% and 90% of those answered yes. So the vast majority of the attendees are working in lands where the species that are considered here are a consideration.
Okay, that's really helpful. I suspected it was a high number, but I didn't realize it was going to be quite that many people. So that's great. So what we decided to do, and again, thanks for participating in that. That's helpful information. What we decided to do was to focus on all the open pine communities, including longleaf dominated communities, but also some of the shortleaf open pine communities and even some natural loblolly stands that were in the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks LCC footprint. But we really wanted to make sure that we dealt with longleaf pine throughout its range. So we also included development of metrics for longleaf pine dominated stands exclusively in the South Atlantic LCC and in Florida. So just in summary, the Gulf Coastal Plain, Ozarks and Ozarks LCC, we were more broad in terms of what we targeted, including open pine stands with longleaf and without. And outside of that footprint of that LCC, we were just looking at longleaf dominated stands. We'll probably try to work, that'll probably be one of the things we try to work on in the future in terms of expanding the footprint of the project and taking on some of the other open pine communities along the East Coast. The other part that we had to tackle fairly early on was we recognized that not all longleaf pine stands are created equal in terms of condition, but the same is true in terms of the underlying soil and hydrology and biogeography that that kind of drives what plant species and what structure is in that particular community. So we came up with, and this took a lot of time, we came up with 7 broad open pine groupings, and within each of those, we developed separate sets of metric cutoffs. So we tried to create the same metrics, which I'll go over in a second, but the metric cutoffs may have differed between groups. In other words, the xeric longleaf pine barrens, which are oftentimes much lower cover of longleaf, may have had a cutoff of high quality in terms of cover values for canopy longleaf that was different than the dry mesic longleaf pine woodlands. And we can talk about that a little bit more and go into that a little more detail about that in a second. So what we developed in the end was a dichotomous key, which folks can use out in the field to determine which of the 7 open pine groupings they're dealing with when they're taking data or when they're doing management. and that's one of the first products in our protocols document. So I'm taking you through a little bit of what our process was to start out. We obviously had to spend the largest chunk of our time using past literature and past studies to come up with the draft open pine metrics that we developed. And we initially developed about 12 metrics, and then we developed the cutoffs between excellent, good, fair, and poor for each of those metrics. And then we sponsored 2 meetings where we invited as large a swath of experts as possible, representing a lot of different agencies and businesses. And we had one of those meetings at the Jones Center and one in conjunction with the Shortleaf Pine Initiative in Knoxville last year? Time flies. I think it was, yeah, it was last fall, last spring and fall. And from that, what we did was we used some simple Excel spreadsheets and graphically portrayed the draft metrics. So this is a spreadsheet we used for, in this case, it would have been longleaf pine basal area. And along one axis, we had the basal area of the longleaf pine. And along the other axis, we had a hypothetical value to wildlife from 0 to 1. And we gave each level of basal area a number along that scale of value to wildlife, 1 being high value to wildlife, 0 being low value to wildlife. We presented that to the folks at the workshop and asked them to comment on us and give us some feedback. And then we took the data that we collected from those experts and tried to look at where the average mean and median scores were close together versus where they were far apart in terms of error bars. And we tried to focus on looking at where there was a lot of disagreement between the experts. We took a second look and really tried to reevaluate whether the numbers that we had originally proposed were correct. And we made a lot of updates and had a kind of a feedback loop with the participants to come up with some final metrics that we all pretty much agreed on. So the main final product is this protocols report, which Greg has made available. I believe is going to be available to all participants. It's also being served up on the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks LCC website, and it will also be up on the NatureServe website as well. And the idea is that we want to create a very as simple as possible approach to developing a score for your stand if you're interested in, say, assessing a longleaf stand that you managed or owned. So in this case, on the left, this is just the report, and on the right is an example of a one-page summary of the metrics. And that's really the crux of what we're reporting.
Ricky?
So, yes.
This is just a time check. It's 1:21, and technically each presentation was 20 minutes, but I think you can easily go another 5 minutes or so because we allowed an entire 20 minutes for questions at the end.
Great, thanks. I think I can finish up in 5. So just going through really quickly what the final product looks like. For each of the 7 ecosystem groups that I talked about earlier, we developed a separate summary one-page sheet. And everything's split up into 3 levels. So there's the canopy metrics, the mid-story metrics, and the ground layer metrics. So for the canopy metrics, we developed 5 metrics. 4 of them are ones, well, the one at the bottom, stand density index, is one that we came up with as in response to a lot of interest from the experts that we brought together. So originally we just had the first 4. We added the 5th as one that you could do optionally if you felt comfortable developing the stand density index. So the idea is that you take data on as many of these as you can, and that's kind of going to give you your canopy score. You can see that, for instance, the canopy hardwood basal area, the fourth one down, you would get an excellent, for instance, if you had less than 20 feet square per acre of basal area of hardwood trees in your assessment area. For the mid-story metrics, we had another 4 metrics that we isolated and got a lot of feedback from. And so the 4 that we ended up with were mid-story fire-tolerant hardwood cover, mid-story overall cover, and then 2 shrub cover metrics, one for tall shrubs and one for short shrubs. And ground layer is one that's been missing from a lot of metrics in the past, but we felt it was really important because if you don't have a healthy ground layer, then that's going to be a problem for some of the species that we're interested in, especially the plant species, but also for the future of the stand. So, you know, for instance, if you don't have longleaf pond regeneration, then that's potentially a problem and should probably count against the health of that stand. Similarly, native herbaceous ground cover needs to be relatively high. Native warm season grass cover needs to be relatively high, and there needs to be a very low presence of invasive plants. So in the end, what we came up with was a one-page field data sheet for each of the 7 ecosystems. And then again, just focusing in on each one. What you're able to do is record a value for each of the metrics, and then there's a process where you can where the metrics are weighted. Right now, they're all weighted equally, so you can end up with a score for the canopy. Again, if you do the mid-story measurements, you can end up with a mid-story score, and you can end up with a ground layer score, and then you can add all of those up to get a final evaluation score, or you can keep them just scored independently depending on your interest and needs. So we're obviously interested in this as these final products as something that land managers can use. We're really focused right now on those land managers that are interested primarily in biodiversity conservation. And for those managers, this tool can help quantify the stand contribution to wildlife habitat. And we hope that we can, you know, if we had a lot of folks that were interested in this and collecting data, we could scale it up and use it for some regional analyses as well. I'm going to skip this slide real quick. The next steps are we feel like we need to add a landscape scale set of metrics, so something that would help us quantify both size and landscape context, since those are very important aspects of the wildlife habitat equation. We wanted to look at applying these approaches in other potential land management scenarios, such as trying to tweak things so that they were customized for lands that were managed more primarily for forest products, which would have to take a different approach. And then we primarily this year are looking at testing the metrics and refining them using an iterative data-driven process. So really working with a lot of folks who have collected data over the last few years to help understand whether the metrics that we've developed are working, and if not, trying to tweak them and fix them. And so that leads us to our last question. Would it be valuable in your own work if we developed a separate set of metrics that was more suitable for use on forests managed for production? So these might focus more on size, landscape context, and proportions of tracts in different stand age classes to quantify value to wildlife. So I'm curious as to whether folks would see that as a valuable thing, either for their work or in general.
Okay, Ricky, I've launched that poll, and give them about 50 more seconds to answer it.
Great. And so that's kind of it for me. I will say that the one last thing I'd like to mention is that we're constantly looking to improve these metrics. And one of the ways we're looking at doing that again is testing the metrics out. I think that's a really good segue to the next presentation, because I feel like a lot of the work that Mike and Laura have done has been to look at the Jones Center and to think about whether the metrics that have been developed in the past, when they apply them to the Jones Center landscape, are matching well with what you would expect on the ground and what they're seeing on the ground in terms of the priority bird species and herb species that they have. So they are starting to look at some of the metrics that we've developed And I think there's at least one slide they're going to present on where they've done a real summary preliminary analysis looking at our metrics and whether they're at least initially looking like they're giving a good indication of or matching up with the actual reality on the ground of where the Bachman sparrows are and things like that. So I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say next, and also looking forward to working with them on some additional projects this next year to help us test some of these ideas out and further refine the metrics.
Okay, Ricky, I've closed the poll. I'm showing the results now. It's we got 49% that say yes, 14% say no, and 37% undecided. So about half the attendees think that that some landscape scale and other metrics would be appropriate.
Great.
And only 14% are rejecting the idea.
I'm curious about the undecided, so maybe if there's time at the end, if folks have questions, they're welcome to bring this back up because there might be some interesting points that folks have about that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ricky, and thank you, Toby. I also wanted to let people know that I do plan to upload the field protocol document to this at the end of the presentation, but I don't want to take away from our next set of presenters. So I now have the pleasure of introducing, hold on just a second, I'm also going to have to switch. I'm going to have to help these guys. Let me see. Well, maybe Toby, you can give them the control for sharing their desktop, and while you're doing that, I will introduce them. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Mike Connor and Dr. Laura L. Smith, both of the Joseph W. Jones Ecological Research Center in Newton, Georgia. Mike Connor received his Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Tennessee at Martin and his MS and PhD degrees from Mississippi State University. He served as an assistant professor at Arkansas Tech University for 3 years before accepting his current assistant scientist position at the Jones Center in 1997. Mike is active in the Wildlife Society and currently serves as the Southeastern Section representative to the Council. His research interests include wildlife habitat relationships and effects of predation on animal communities and their habitats. Laura Smith is an associate scientist at the Jones Center, where her work includes a long-term study of the effects of mammalian predators on gopher tortoises, upland snake ecology, and habitat predictors of pond breeding amphibians. Her research interests also include the effects of habitat restoration and management on amphibians and reptiles. So now make sure your phones are unmuted and take it away.
Thank you, Greg. So before I get started, I would also like to acknowledge the GCPO LCC for their funding of this work, and also Beth Schlim, who was a research technician who did a lot of the modeling work with us. So as Ricky said, we're going to be talking about using wildlife habitat models to evaluate management endpoints for open pine woodlands and savanna. And our project addressed an information need identified in the draft science agenda of the and Ozarks LCC, which was to evaluate and quantify the relationship between wildlife species and these landscape endpoints. Specifically, we use wildlife habitat models to evaluate the management endpoints for a longleaf pine savanna. And geographically, our project fell in the eastern part of the, in the East Gulf Coastal Plain region of the LCC. So within the draft integrated science agenda, they list desired landscape endpoints, or as we'll refer to them, DOEs, for open pine woodlands based on literature review and expert opinion. At a landscape level, the desired state is 20 million acres, and the desired configuration is in patch sizes greater than 600 acres and with patches less than 2 miles apart. But at the stand level, the science agenda lists desired endpoints for stand conditions or habitat metrics. And these include herbaceous ground cover, shrub cover, canopy cover, and basal area of all pine trees and basal area of large pines, specifically those greater than 14 inches in diameter at breast height. Our project focused on developing species habitat models at this stand level. The specific objectives of our project were to develop wildlife habitat models, to evaluate the ability of these desired landscape endpoints to predict species occurrence, and we also used our habitat models to provide adjusted desired endpoints for wildlife species based on a reference site. And lastly, we developed a tool for managers to evaluate habitat conditions for wildlife. And actually, I'm going to interrupt myself and point out that Mike and I are actually going to solicit the questions from the participants at the end of our presentation. So our models were developed from data that we collected here at HOA, the 29,000-acre research site of the Joseph W. Jones Ecological Research Center in southwestern Georgia. And HOA has about 18,000 acres of fire-maintained longleaf pine savanna, the majority of which has intact native ground cover dominated by wiregrass. Other forest types at HOA include mixed pine hardwood forest and hardwood-dominated forest in association with a stream on the property. The uplands are managed with prescribed fire on a 1 to 2 return interval, and HOA has all but one of the species listed as limited by habitat characteristic in the LCC's integrated science agenda. And here's the list that Ricky showed of the species designated within the integrated science agenda as potentially limited by habitat conditions in open woodlands and savanna systems. And we developed habitat models for all of these except for the red cockaded woodpecker and the prairie warbler. And this is because the red cockaded woodpecker was reintroduced to HOA, and since we established the birds and habitat that met particular conditions, any models based on their occurrence would be biased. We also did not develop a model for the prairie warbler, which is very rare on our site. And lastly, we did develop models for the Florida pine snake as a surrogate for the Louisiana pine snake, which doesn't occur in Georgia, but they're ecologically similar. And the ISA, or Integrated Science Agenda, also includes a broader list of species that they consider representative of open pine woodlands and savanna, such as the fox squirrel, and we do have sufficient data here to develop a model for this species as well. And I also wanted to mention that among these species, several are of conservation concern. The gopher tortoise here in the eastern portion of its range is a candidate for federal listing as a threatened species, and the eastern diamondback is also under review for listing. So in this table, we're presenting aspects of the biology of the species that we develop models for, which are the basis for predictions about their response to different habitat conditions presented in the Integrated Science Agenda. For example, for ground nesting and ground foraging species like backland sparrow and northern bobwhite, we would predict a positive association with habitat with higher percent herbaceous ground cover, and we might expect to see a negative association with conditions of higher canopy cover, shrub cover, and overall high basal area of pine. On the other hand, the brown-headed nuthatches and pine warbler forage on insects on bark and nest in trees, as do fox squirrel. So we might expect a more positive association with canopy cover and basal area of large pines for these species. Pocket gophers and gopher tortoise, which are herbivores, are likely to respond positively to high herbaceous cover. Snakes and gopher tortoises that bask to maintain their body temperature would be expected to be positively associated with lower canopy cover. And just to keep in mind here is that for these species, their presence is likely to be related to a range of conditions rather than some absolute measure. So with our models, we were trying to capture that range of conditions that explains the presence of these species. We were able to use existing data to develop a habitat model.
Yeah, but maybe you didn't use that.
Okay, sorry, that's quite in advance, but here we are. So we were able to use existing data to develop habitat models. We had presence data from point counts for birds and presence data from radio telemetry for several other of the species listed here. And we also had point data from incidental observations of the 2 snake species on the around the property. And we did systematic burrow surveys for tortoises and for pocket gopher mounds. To obtain habitat data or habitat variables or landscape endpoints, we used data from 864 long-term monitoring plots that were sampled from 2010 to 2013 across Ichway. And at each of these plots, we were able to extrapolate basal area of pines based on diameter at breast height measurements. And we had measurements of percent shrub cover, canopy cover, and herbaceous cover. We included an additional variable, percent sand composition, from a statewide soils data set models with the fossorial or below ground species, the pine snake, gopher tortoise, and southeastern pocket gopher. Okay. Not advancing my slide. There we go. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So the first challenge was to identify the best approach for extrapolating the habitat variables from the plot level to the Ichway landscape. And we explored two different methods for this, and we're going to present both of those because those of you interested in using the models might elect to choose one method over the other depending on your particular circumstances. Okay, so the first method involves interpolation, and we use the inverse distance weighting tool in ArcMap to interpolate continuous raster surfaces between the long-term monitoring plots. We then binned the interpolated data and reassigned the midpoint value of the bins to the interpolated rasters to smooth out some of the variation. The second method we used to extrapolate the habitat data from the plot level data was land cover based. We have detailed land cover data for the site from 2011, and the data include land cover classes within burn units on the property. And so we assigned the habitat condition values measured at these long-term monitoring plots to the land cover polygons in which they fell. If more than one plot fell in a particular land cover polygon, we assigned the average values of the condition metric to that polygon. If a polygon did not contain a long-term monitoring plot, then we assigned the values from the nearest long-term monitoring plot within the same land cover class. We had additional data on pine basal area for some of our pine plantation polygons, and we used these data to assign total pine basal area and large pine basal area to our pine plantations wherever possible. And after the values for the condition metrics were assigned to our land cover polygons, we converted vector layers to 30-meter rasters for use as predictor variables in our species habitat models. So we had both an interpolated and an assigned raster surfaces to work with. And we used the Mahalanobis distance approach to develop the wildlife habitat models. And Mahalanobis distance is a method of measuring how similar a particular set of conditions is to an ideal. And the method can be useful for identifying locations most similar to that ideal. And an advantage to Mahalanobis distance modeling approach is that it just requires presence data. And the Mahalanobis distance approach uses the raster layers created for the habitat variables. In our case, there were 5 or 6 of these, if you included soil or not, for the fossorial species. And the mean values for all cells with animal locations are extracted and used to generate a mean vector and covariance matrix for each species. The Mahalanobis distance follows the chi-square distribution with n-1 degrees of freedom, where n is the number of habitat variables, and the conversion of Mahalanobis distances of the predictor habitat variables to chi-square p-values with scale from 0 to 1 can be directly interpreted as habitat suitability indices. So p-values close to 0 reflect high Mahalanobis distance values and are therefore very dissimilar to the ideal combination of those predictor variables. P-values close to 1 reflect low Mahalanobis distances and are therefore very similar to the ideal combination of predictor variables. So in short, the closer the p-value is to 1, the more similar that combination of predictor variables is to the ideal combination. And so here are the results from the initial models for one of the species, the gopher tortoise in this case. And we're showing the output for both the interpolated and assigned models for the gopher tortoise here. And in the graphics, the bright green represents the high suitability habitat, whereas bright red represents unsuitable or less suitable. So in the upper right of each graphic, the legend shows a range from 0 for unsuitable habitat to essentially 1 for high suitability habitat. And the tables below the graphics list the mean and standard error values for the habitat condition variables. So if you look on the left, the interpolated model predicted a mean for percent herbaceous cover of about 41 or 42, whereas the assigned model output shows a pretty similar value for percent ground cover of about 45. And values for most of these condition metrics were pretty similar for the two methods, with the exception of percent shrub cover, which was higher in the assigned model. But at this point, we elected to go ahead and use the assigned modeling approach rather than the interpolated approach because we felt it just presented more realistic habitat boundaries for our site. But the interpolation approach is adequate if you don't have detailed land cover data for your site. And so here are the summary statistics for the bird and mammal species produced from the assigned models. And what's presented in the series of graphs, you'll see several of these throughout the presentation, but we've got the means and the standard deviation, the habitat condition values shown with a black whisker plot. And behind these, shown as solid green bars, are the range for each of the desired landscape endpoints or habitat condition metrics from the integrated science agenda. So these were sort of the theoretical estimates. For bald sparrow, you can see on the top left, the mean values for large pine basal area and percent shrub cover fell pretty much within the desired landscape endpoints, but the variables for the all pine basal area and the percent herbaceous cover and cover fell largely outside of the DLEs. And you see a similar pattern for the other species, where it appears the birds occurred in sites with lower all pine basal area and herbaceous cover and higher canopy cover than suggested by the DLEs in the integrated science agenda. Here are the summary statistics for the reptiles, where you see a similar pattern with regard to all pine basal area, herbaceous cover, and canopy cover. So to summarize all of this, our data suggests that the desired landscape endpoints for these three condition metrics may be too restrictive. And also, I think it's worth noting that none of the species that we examined seem to be critically tied to any one variable. So at this point, we'll transition to Mike Connor, and he's going to talk about a multi-species approach to defining a range of habitat conditions, or the so-called sweet spot. Mike?
Thanks. So I'm going to transfer some technology here. Okay. All right, if you think about the wildlife species that we've been discussing, you will realize that some of them do not actually require open pine conditions to exist. For example, northern bobwhite and the southeastern pocket gopher are often found in areas completely devoid of trees. However, if you find several of these species occurring in the same location, there's an excellent chance that you're at a site that is representative of quality open pine conditions. To explore this idea, we average habitat values on a cell-by-cell basis across our study area for the bird species used in our modeling efforts. The results of this effort are graphically depicted here. I want to point out that the summary statistics look very similar to those obtained on a species-by-species basis that Laura presented, and that the relationship between the composite HSI summaries and the proposed range for these values is also consistent with the individual species models. And my keyboard is dead.
We have a wireless keyboard here.
And we're dead.
Would you like for Toby to launch one of your first questions while you're fixing that?
Sure, I guess, but we're still having trouble. Everything's dead on this end.
Huh. Hey, what, Toby, why don't you launch the first question, and I would suggest, Mike, that if it's dead, you just try and restart the whole thing.
Greg, we seem to have it back. I don't know what happened, though, so there's no guarantee that we won't have a similar problem in a moment.
We never lost the picture on our end, though.
We didn't lose the picture, but I couldn't advance the slide.
I see.
So I don't know what that was, but we seem to be okay now. So how about I continue? And
okay.
If we get in this message in, we'll figure out what to do.
That's good.
So this, for this particular slide, this represents where we've averaged all of the 9 Mahalanobis distance models. And again, the thing to notice here is that the summary statistics remain consistent with the individual species models and retain the same relationship between overall HSI and proposed ranges depicted in green. So the thing here is, what does all this tell us? In all cases, we observe some overlap between the HSI values and the suggested values. But in some cases, overlap was not that great. Overlap was least for total pine basal area, percent canopy cover, and herbaceous ground cover. I want to hold off on discussing the discrepancy in herbaceous ground cover until later. And here I want to specifically focus on canopy closure and pine basal area. First, I want to point out that the DLEs for canopy closure were lower. The suggested DLEs for canopy closure were lower than predicted by our models, while the DLE for pine basal area was higher. This was confusing because you would expect a positive relationship between basal area and canopy closure. In other words, if one increases, you expect the other to increase also. Because our HSI values were based on observed data, this caused us to question the proposed DLEs. To evaluate this idea, we extracted canopy closure and basal area measurements from all of our long-term monitoring plots that were located within natural longleaf pine forests. This is the graph to your right. Each point represents pine basal area and canopy closure at a long-term monitoring plot. This area represents proposed DLE ranges. As you can see, there were very few instances where both basal area and canopy closure met the proposed desired values, suggesting values for these metrics should be reconsidered. Our next efforts were focused on simplifying our models by reducing the number of predictor variables. This is often referred to in a question as just how many lines are needed for a viewer to recognize that we're drawing an element. This question has been used in statistics classes to introduce the idea of model simplification generalization, and this idea drove the next aspect of our analysis. Large pine basal area, total pine basal area, herbaceous ground cover, canopy closure, and shrub cover represent vegetation variables that we would assume to be correlated. This suggests that perhaps we do not need all these variables to adequately describe a desirable open pine condition. Our first effort at variable reduction included using the 2 least correlated variables, pine basal area and herbaceous ground cover. Models based on just these 2 variables provided very poor agreement with models using all of the predictors. In all cases, the correlation coefficient was less than 0.7, indicating that less than half the variation in one model was explained by the other, and suggested that 2 variables were insufficient for identifying desirable open pine conditions. Our second effort focused on removing herbaceous ground cover as a predictor. If you remember, we previously mentioned the lack of agreement between proposed values for herbaceous ground cover and summary statistics generated by our modeling effort. To remind you, the proposed DLE values were much greater than suggested by our models. We think this was probably due to the frequent fire regime used to manage open pine grasslands on our study site. More frequent burns will result in more time with less ground cover than may be expected on sites that are burned less frequently. Because herbaceous ground cover will vary greatly based on the time since fire, we explored the ability of models to identify suitable open pine conditions for our indicator species when herbaceous ground cover was excluded as a predictor. This slide demonstrates HSI values based on 2 separate models. One developed using all 5 predictors, is depicted on your left, and a model excluding herbaceous ground cover is depicted on your right. Results were encouraging, as indicated by a fairly decent correlation of HSI values between the two models. Importantly, this particular comparison is for the Florida pine snake, and this represents the worst correlation among all pairs of models. So, dropping herbaceous ground cover as a predictor has little impact on HSI values within our fire maintaining system. Now, the next two slides, I won't dwell on these too long, but just to kind of give you an idea of how similar the two types of models were. Here you see our composite model based strictly on bird species, and over 80% of the variation in one model was explained by the other. And similarly, when we compared the composite model using all species, we had a similarly high correlation coefficient. So clearly the correlations were good for all comparisons. However, it's important to point out that in less frequently burned systems, this relationship may not hold because the addition of different prescribed fire intervals could substantially reduce the correlation between ground cover and other predictors. The same concern occurs as a result of site-specific differences. For example, on sites with more fertile soil, vegetation may recover more rapidly following the fire event. As with varying burn regimes, this would also reduce correlation between herbaceous ground cover and other predictors. So, after all this modeling, what have the animals suggested as their preference for the metric values? For total pine basal area, the preferred range when averaging over all the species we studied was roughly 20 to 55 square feet per acre. For large pine, the preferred range was about 15 to 45 square feet per acre. Preferred range for canopy cover was about 45 to 75%, and shrub cover less than 20% was preferred. And then finally, on our side, with our burn regime, herbaceous ground cover between 30 and 70% seemed most used by the wildlife species that we studied. As we bring our presentation to a close, we want to mention a couple of tools that may be of interest. We have an Excel-based tool under development that some of you may find useful. This tool provides a platform for users to enter values for habitat variables. Once the values are entered, the tool then calculates an HSI for a species of interest. Users can examine the standardized distances to gain insight into which variable needs to be manipulated to increase the HSI value. This will be the variable with the largest absolute value for the standardized difference. Currently, the tool works, but safeguards need to be put in place before release to the public. This tool is also limited in that it will provide an HSI value for a single set of inputs. Thus, developing a spatially explicit model of habitat suitability for a given area would be difficult using this product. The tool's greatest value is that it provides the ability to ask what-if questions and to explore relationships among habitat variables. Although the version shown here requires a value for herbaceous ground cover, we have a separate version that does not contain this variable. For those with access to ArcMap, our final report contains instructions for extrapolating the model to other landscapes. These instructions combine explanatory text with actual screenshots to help reduce the learning curve associated with using the model in a GIS environment. Mean vectors and covariance matrices for each of the species are provided in the final report, so users would only need spatially explicit data layers for each of the landscape metrics in the model. Just within the last week or so, we've taken preliminary steps to evaluate the metrics provided in the rapid assessment tool relative to our HSI model. Ricky's team partitioned metric values into excellent, good, fair, and poor categories. We thought it would be a good idea then to explore the range of HSI values associated with these categories. So we used their rapid assessment metrics for dry and mesoclone longleaf pine woodlands and ran our model using some of their values. We found the general trends among the rapid assessment values in HSI encouraging. However, this exercise was meant as an example only, as there were far too many ways to combine values from metrics. In other words, there's a minimum and a maximum value for each metric within each category. For example, an excellent basal area was defined as 35 to 75 square feet per acre. We only use 35. Also, there are real-world correlations among values that need to be considered. Otherwise, you get absurd combinations of values. To illustrate, the range associated with poor canopy closure values from the rapid assessment was less than 5% or greater than 90%. Poor total pine basal area was considered less than 10 square feet per acre or greater than 105. It would be impossible to have less than 10 square feet per acre of basal area and 90% canopy cover. So again, this graph is just intended as an example to show how the tools resulting from our two projects that we've presented today may be integrated. There are obvious limitations to our work. We wish we could claim that the results of our work describe wildlife preferences for open pine savanna habitats throughout the southeast. However, we can't do that given the limited geographical extent of our work. Secondly, if you remember, there were also DLEs associated with patch size and connectivity, and these landscape level attributes are critical for sustaining wildlife populations. Because our data came from one fairly large study site, we could not assess landscape level impacts. It's important to keep in mind that vegetation conditions could be in a desirable state, but occur in a patch that is too small or too isolated to support the wildlife species we study. Because vegetation conditions may be favorable, even though wildlife species are absent, managers should be careful when using wildlife indicators as a metric for evaluating vegetation management. We suggest that presence of viable populations of desired species is certainly a useful metric when evaluating habitat conditions at a landscape scale, but users should be careful when suggesting local scale vegetation manipulations based on the absence of these wildlife indicator species. In other words, the presence of viable populations of 3 or 4 species may indicate a desirable vegetation condition, but their absence does not mean stand level vegetation is inadequate. Could be that the landscape level attributes are lacking. When species are absent, vegetation should be evaluated based on our models, the rapid assessment approach suggested by Ricky, or a combination of these approaches. For next steps, there's a strong theoretical basis for the idea that our HSI values are in fact correlated with the probability of occupancy. We know that a 0.9 is better than a 0.4. However, we do not know if a 0.4 is unsuitable or if a 0.8 is definitely suitable. So we're working to identify those things. And in the process, we hope that we'll be able to collect more data, and this will help us to better generalize our models throughout the Southeast. And with that, Toby, I guess maybe you could launch the poll questions, and we'll be happy to take any questions that may have been generated.
Okay, we're launching the poll now. The question is, what impediments are there to collecting presence data for indicator wildlife species at your site? And you can select more than one. We also got a couple of questions during during Ricky White's presentation. Greg, I guess we'll have some time later after this to talk about those.
Yeah, I think as soon as we finish the poll questions, we can start with that one question, because it was basically intended to sort of jumpstart a discussion about the basal area, and I think it should be interesting. I think we can actually unmute Matt Traeger because he asked that question. We could unmute him and let him ask that question directly.
Well, I'm also seeing a question from Sean Bloom. I think it came early in Ricky's presentation about whether or not his presentation applied to longleaf only or also to shortleaf and loblolly, and perhaps that got answered as Ricky went on, because he does have models for those other species in the full report. So this poll has been up for a minute and a half now. 75% have voted. I'm going to go ahead and close it and share the results. It looks like that funding is by far the most common impediment, 77%, 38% site expertise, 30% low priority, 13% not applicable. So those are the results, and that'll be available with the report that comes out at the end of the webinar. So again, 77% is the respondents chose funding, and hiding that should put it back into your hands, Mike. You want me to launch the next one?
Sure, Toby, go ahead and just launch all three. We wanted to wait until the end to do ours.
So this is the next poll is now launched. The question is, of the indicator species modeled, please select those you would consider a priority for monitoring. And so once again, we'll give the attendees about a minute to answer this one.
I'll just also explain that we would have liked to have listed all 8 of the different species that they focused on, but we're limited by the technology to 5 answers. So this is how we parsed it out.
Right, we had to dump Bachman's sparrow and the others into the category of songbirds. And it's a little over a minute. We've got 70% have voted. Oh, some people are still voting. I think I'm going to go ahead and close this. We've got 80% are saying songbirds, 69% northern bobwhite quail, 61% gopher tortoise, 33% snakes, and 18% on the pocket gopher. So they are the attendees responded in descending order based of the order of the species are listed, and it's not a lot of surprises there. We'll hide those results and launch the third and final poll, which asks, what impediments might you face in developing a Mahalanobis distance model for wildlife at your site? We're about 40 seconds in. I'll give you guys about 15 more seconds. About 70% have voted. And closing it, sharing the results. Since Mike and Lori can't see it, the ArcGIS skills, only about 8% answer that. Habitat condition data, 42%. Presence of data for indicator wildlife was the most popular response with 48%. All of the above, 27%, and other 6%.
Okay, well, thank you for launching those, Toby. I guess we now don't know how to proceed. So, Greg, can you provide some guidance, I guess, from here on?
Yeah, so as Toby pointed out, we have 2 questions from 2 different folks, and I'm sorry I didn't notice the Sean Bloom's question. It was lost up in the earlier section, but I'm going to go ahead, and I think Sean Bloom and Matthew Traeger, who both gave us questions, are still online. So I'm going to unmute Sean Bloom's line, and he should be able to go ahead and ask his question to, I think it was to Ricky. Are you there, Sean? Would you like to ask your question? Well, I'm going to go ahead and ask it for him. I don't know if there's an issue there. He basically said, is this presentation applicable to other pine habitats, shortleaf and loblolly?
I assume that was to Ricky? Or...
Yeah, and so let me hold on, let me make sure that Ricky's... Ricky, I think you might be muted.
Well, I can actually answer that. I think Ricky did mention it, and it was just in passing, and it wasn't the primary focus of the presentation. But the shortleaf and loblolly metrics are a part of of his final report, and those were he developed those for those communities within the boundaries of the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks LCC, whereas for the longleaf he developed metrics for the entire range of longleaf.
That's right.
So Ricky's back on. He can add some more detail to that, I guess.
Yeah, that was basically it. If you want to give me control, I can pop up a quick slide that shows that geographically, I guess. This was the slide that I had up when I was talking about that. I think, yeah, so what Toby said, basically we are doing open pine, including stands that have shortleaf and loblolly and slash in this Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks LCC footprint. And then we're just doing longleaf dominated stands in the South Atlantic LCC and the Florida Peninsula LCC. But we would like to expand that to all the open pine types in those areas in the future.
Okay, thanks. Our next question was from Matthew Traeger, and I'm going to go ahead and try and unmute him so he can ask his question. It's quite a long question that I already shared with everybody in the audience via the chat box. But Matthew, are you? Well, I don't know if it has to do with our issues. Wait, what was that?
I can
summarize. Are you there, Matthew?
The no, this is Ricky.
Okay, yeah. You want to go ahead and I can read the question, or you can read it, Ricky?
Well, the way I interpreted the question was just real quickly, and you can add to this if you think I got it wrong, is that basal area and canopy cover are really imperfect metrics by themselves to help us determine habitat quality for certain species, and I think that's correct. So the idea is that you can get 30 to 80 feet square per acre basal area with a ton of small trees or a few large trees, and similarly canopy cover can tell you something, but it doesn't give you the whole story. So so that was his comment. I agree with that, and we heard that a lot when we were developing these metrics. So a couple of things that we've got here. One is that we don't exclusively rely on basal area and canopy cover to come up with the final canopy measurement. We're also looking at stand age structure, which takes into account how many large trees you have per acre, essentially, and also the hardwood component. But the other thing that we've done in response to that is we looked at creating, instead of basal area and canopy cover for pine, we thought about creating the stand density index for pine species and having that be a substitute for the basal area and canopy cover. But it's not yet been, that measurement is still something that a lot of people are uncomfortable with in terms of not having a lot of familiarity with it. And so instead it's an either or situation. You can either calculate the stand density index or you can use basal area and canopy cover to help calculate that canopy measurement. So it's still not perfect, and I think we're looking to try to test out stand density index, especially to see if we can just substitute it for basal area and canopy cover. But I think it's trying to get at the question that you brought up.
Okay, and then we had another question that we have some more questions that are coming through, and this is a relatively brief one, so I'm just going to read it. It's from Shelley Johnson, and it is, do the environmental conditions at the Jones Center reflect the full range of metric values included in the rapid assessment? If not, do you think it is a reliable test of the rapid assessment metrics?
First of all, I wouldn't say that we were attempting to test the rapid assessment metrics, but we were trying to evaluate the DLEs that were put forth in the integrated science agenda. And do we have the entire range in the rapid assessment? Probably not. Again, you have to realize that the HSI models that we developed were based, strictly on this property. What we would expect if we tried to expand the work off-site was that our variation would simply increase, that the range of acceptable values would increase as we encompassed other sites that contain these species. One thing, I don't know if that's exactly answering the question.
Yeah, I can see where the question came from, because Ricky's group and our group started our project simultaneously, and so we based our models on what was really a draft integrated science agenda and tested whether the wildlife occurred under those suite of conditions. So there's a little bit of time factor in there. But
right, and in terms of evaluating the rapid assessment, all we've done with that is the one slide that we presented today, and that represents efforts that are literally about a week old. Well, one thing I'd like to, if we could go back to the basal area question that was mentioned earlier, as we were looking at these rapid assessments, as I pointed out in the presentation, there were a number of ways we could plug values into our models, and so it became obvious very quickly that to do an exhaustive comparison of the rapid assessment, or not, it's not even a comparison, but rather to run the methods of the rapid assessment through our model would take quite an effort to explore all the potential variables. But one thing that did jump out immediately was the importance of the ratio of the large pine basal area to total overall basal area. If you could have, as the person asking the question pointed out, you can actually have a fairly high overall basal area as long as there's a great proportion of that overall basal area is made up of the larger trees. And so that was a really good point. But anyway, I'm probably jumping in when I shouldn't. But
well, we have another question here. Actually, we have a couple of questions from Chuck Hunter, and I'm going to see if I can unmute him and let him ask these questions. Are you there, Chuck?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
So yeah, just a couple things. One point that I've tried to make in terms of the work that's actually I didn't write in here is that although we did not specifically cover shortleaf and natural loblolly and slash outside the Gulf Coastal Plains Ozarks, my projection would be that what has developed in this document should be equally adaptable to those habitat conditions in the South Atlantic and Peninsula Florida. But anyway, that's maybe something that could be assessed in the future, but I think it's pretty good going beyond longleaf. Anyway, so I'm kind of hitting on the herbaceous conditions is my first comment / question. I think Mike has covered this, that you know, the generally excellent conditions at Jitchaway seem to indicate at a landscape level that herbaceous cover may not have been as, or high percentage of herbaceous cover may not have been as important as originally thought, but I can pretty much guarantee you on a vast majority of public lands that at least I'm familiar with, where you have such a limited amount of herbaceous ground cover because it's all taken up in palmetto or oak, depending on the habitat, saplings, that trying to get patches back at high percentages of grassy ground cover within a landscape is pretty critical. So maybe, again, there's more work that needs to be done there, but I don't hope nobody comes away going, well, we don't need to worry about herbaceous ground cover as much as some people think. I think we need to critically keep that high focus on high percentage as much as we can, wherever we can there. So I'll stop there, and then I had the two other points, if anybody wants to comment on that.
Hey, Greg, if you don't mind, I would like to follow up with what Chuck just said. It's not, and I absolutely agree, Chuck, we don't want anybody to think that herbaceous ground cover is not important. It's obviously very important. From the standpoint of developing wildlife models, though, the reason we excluded that variable was because we realized that our frequent burning regime may be resulting in the discrepancy that we saw on our site relative to what was suggested in the DLE. And we also recognize that this is one of those variables that, for instance, if you actually measure herbaceous ground cover immediately after a fire, it'll be 0. And so we felt like that may be affecting our results. And so that's the reason we took it out. We did not take it out because we felt it was unimportant. And I won't
no, and I didn't think, right. And the reason I pointed this out is exactly as you said, Mike, that we need to be careful how sometimes this gets messaged. But the other, I guess, the side comment is the better the landscape overall, which way, if you want to call that a landscape or part of a landscape, you know, that a lot of things that we see that seems like really highly correlated at a local level, all of a sudden doesn't become as important. So you know, we see that in red-cockaded woodpeckers in areas where, you know, the conditions for Apalachicola or some huge areas are really good shape, that frankly a lot of things we emphasize in smaller populations no longer seem to be as important, but in those smaller populations they're still important. So it's something to just keep in mind.
Right.
Unless there's other comments, I'll go on to the second.
Tell you what, Chuck, I don't want to cut you off, but we do have one other person, a question. We have questions from other folks who've already asked questions, and then we have one other person that we haven't heard from. So let's go to her, and then we'll come back to you if we have time. And if not, as we said, we promise we'll get back to everybody on all the questions they've submitted. But we have Mara Omega submitted a question. Actually, Mara, I don't think she's not even here anymore. Oh, there she is. There she is. Mara, can you hear me? Are you there? No mic. She doesn't have a mic. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just read her question, which was, and perhaps you guys will be able to figure out, I know she must have, this must be a typo. She says, how much peaking in the future do you think might take place relative to weighting? Tweaking. Okay, there you go. On one natural conservation site here in North Carolina, the overstory species was
of no consequence.
No consequence to the understory habitat that they were actively saving.
Right.
And then density mattered, but they had an offsite / overstory.
Right. I think that's kind of almost the opposite of Chuck's earlier point. You know, I think that that's the reason why we split these into canopy, midstory, and ground layer metrics, because you can easily have an out of condition overstory with a relatively healthy other two layers, especially if the out of condition overstory is out of condition because it doesn't have any trees in it. You know, in the case of, you know, those famous cases of some of the bombing ranges at some of the bases where the fire has been so persistent for so long that there aren't that many trees there, but the herbaceous layer is, really diverse and very amazing. So, there's a lot of examples where maybe the different layers have different values to think about. And in some cases, that's okay for all of the species as well, as Mike pointed out. It's many of the species that rely on quote-unquote open pine don't even really need trees in them. Others do. So, I think, to me, this points out that there's an ability for folks to customize how they interpret the data that they get from this for their own needs. So it may be that some managers might be okay with a lower score in the canopy if the lower score is generated because they have a lower density of trees than maybe was suggested in the metrics. Other folks might be really uncomfortable with that, especially if they're trying to do both management for forest products and biodiversity. They'll, obviously they would want some trees in those areas to be able to harvest later. So there's a lot of, I think it's a good point. There's a lot of issues to be thinking about. And the weighting itself, we do want to tweak as we go, but we don't have enough data yet to do anything other than weight them equally at this point in time. So I think as we get more data, we may look at weighting the different metrics differentially.
Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and unmute Chuck Hunter again for his second question.
This is just an observation as well that something to keep in mind, and this goes beyond the original scope of some of the work we've been talking about here. As we restore longleaf habitats, it's been a long debate, but it's starting to get pretty intense regarding planting densities best for reaching some of the desired conditions in the future. And I won't belabor it here, but there are quite a few observations of plantations that were planted with very low densities 25 years ago, that is well below 500 trees per acre, that are probably not going to attain the desired conditions we're talking about here. And that's being done largely based on shorter-term wildlife objectives for gopher tortoise and others. And so we have to be very careful about what we set in stage now, especially for longleaf, where we are hoping we can move a lot of these areas into DFC-like conditions, but we may be hampering our ability to do that with planting densities. There's still more discussion that needs to be done there. Anyone wishes to comment on that, I'd be happy to hear it. And if not, the third point, again, sort of outside the realm of our discussion, was the importance of other habitats embedded within these longleaf systems, especially with ephemeral ponds for breeding amphibians, that we did not strongly consider during this effort, but turns out it may have been something that may be more important than everything else we're talking about, given the status of a number of pond breeding amphibians in decline, serious decline.
Chuck, this is Laura. Thought I'd just chime in here, is that we didn't present it today because we had so much material to cover, and the methods are really important, I think. But we did look at a suite of amphibian species as well. We weren't able to model those because our presence data was limited to breeding sites, which are just a handful of wetlands, but we were able to look at the habitat condition metrics within different biologically relevant buffers around those. So that information is in our report, and what was pretty interesting there was that the condition metrics are the same pattern as with the other species that we modeled that were purely terrestrial. So they fell within this, the overlap the DLEs for all pines and present shrub cover, but fell slightly outside for herbaceous ground cover and large pine basil. I was confused as to, but anyway, it was pretty similar results.
Okay,
we did not ignore amphibians.
No, and I wasn't actually talking about you. I was talking about us
in general.
in radio. in terms of the effort on the DFCs. So I was more referring to not evaluating that in terms of our initial effort across the Southeast.
And that may be something, Chuck.
Yeah.
Yeah, that may be something that we would want to do in the next phase as part of the landscape scale metrics development, because that's almost more tied to the landscape scale than the stand scale in many ways. You know, presence of the appropriate habitat for salamanders may be a different scale than what we're measuring here.
Okay, we have 2 more minutes, and we have one more question. I think this will probably have to be the last one. If anybody else has questions, please go ahead and enter them, and we'll get to them after the webinar is over. This comes again from Shelley Johnson. And Shelley, I'm going to try unmuting you. Are you there? Shelley? For some reason, her sound doesn't appear to be working. But I'm going to read it to you. It's, how reliable do you think the rapid assessment results might be if not all metrics are able to be included? For example, if we were able to include 4 canopy metrics, but only 1 mid-story and 1 ground cover metric, would you recommend adjusting the weights or keeping each at 1/3 for canopy, mid, and ground? One concern I have would be that then the 1 mid-story and 1 ground cover metric would have a lot of influence.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we've designed these so that you can skip some metrics if you don't have that data and still generate a value. We just feel like it would be, you know, the fewer metrics you take, the less reliable that measure would potentially be. But it's probably better than no measure at all. So yeah, I think we'd say yes, you could potentially collect all 4 canopy metrics and maybe 1 mid-story and 1 ground cover metric, and you could choose to weight the canopy, the mid-story, and the ground cover equally if you wanted, but that final measurement might not be as reliable as if you had 2 mid-story and 2 ground cover metrics or something like that. And we recognize that not all the metrics are really equal, so I would suggest that the ground layer, you know, the invasive plant presence distribution is probably the least useful in terms of thinking about some of these cutoffs. So if you just had that, you didn't have the other 3, I think it wouldn't be terribly reliable. It'd be nice to have at least one of those other 3 as well.
Okay, great. And it's now 2:30, and I wanted to point out to everybody that in your dashboard under handouts, you do have the field protocols for Southern Open Pine now available for download, and I'm going to leave the I'm not going to close out the webinar for a few minutes, so you can download that if you haven't done so already. And I just want to thank you very much to all 3 of our presenters, Ricky White, Mike Connor, and Laura Smith. And thank you, Toby Gray, for helping to run the webinar. Thanks, everyone. You're going to get a link to the recording in a couple days after this is over. Bye.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.